Joining us now on The Debate for the full hour tonight, in the nation's capital, Cameron Montgomery, professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Ottawa. And back here in studio, Michael Decter, who 20 years ago tried to negotiate with teacher unions through the social contract process. Doretta Wilson from the Society for Quality Education. Doug Little, former Toronto School Board trustee who now publishes the Little Education Report. And Martin Redcon, Queen's Park columnist for the Toronto Star. Good to have everybody around the table here. And Cam, nice to have you on the line from the nation's capital. 1 week ago today, Dalton McGuinty posted this to YouTube. Roll tape.
Strong public finances build confidence. And that means people and businesses spend and invest in our province. And that investment grows the economy and creates jobs. And jobs and economic growth, well, they support strong schools and good hospitals. Getting there won't be easy. It's going to take an unwavering commitment. And we need to make the right choices for our students. That's why we choose to move forward with full-day kindergarten. And we're choosing to keep class sizes small. To make that happen, we're asking teachers for a real 2-year wage freeze. We're asking for an end to a generous sick leave plan that allows some teachers to get paid upon retirement for 200 unused sick days. Balancing the budget means making choices. Our government's choice is to protect the classroom.
Cameron Montgomery, what did you think of that video?
Well, Steve, I think it's an interesting medium that he's using YouTube because it only goes in one direction. It's unidirectional. There's no debate. That's my first reaction. As an educator, I like to hear discussion and debate, and that's not the case. And there's no mention of consultation with the Ontario College of Teachers, school boards, or teachers themselves. It's quite alarming and shocking, Steve, to be quite honest.
As a shot across the bow, how did it work?
Well, I don't think it went very far. I think if you look online, as I did earlier today, he had about 20,000 hits. That's not bad, but considering there are over 100,000 teachers in this province, I'm not sure it went that far. Look, he's a premier. He's not a president or a prime minister. He can't call the networks. He can't call even the public broadcaster in Ontario and get airtime. So it's a way to get some earned airtime, some free media by having it repeated on stations like this. I think it's an attempt to at least set the stage and to tell teachers that he's not going to beat them up, but he's going to show them maybe some tough love and give them a sense that set the table, things have changed, he's been good to them, he needs them, and they need him.
As we suggested off the top, Michael, you went through this a little over 20 years ago with the teacher unions, negotiating on behalf of Bob Rae's government to try to get them to put a little water in their wine so that lots of people wouldn't lose their jobs. That was a bit of a tough process. Here's stage one in the process for 2012. How do you think it went?
Well, I think that the Liberals are trying a much softer approach, and they're not intervening in collective bargaining. There have been some complaints that the very existence of the YouTube video is interference, but I think that's an odd view. What he set out was essentially a prelude to the budget, that if you've read Drummond, and I think most people involved have, the province's deficit is getting larger, not smaller, and therefore what the Liberal government is trying to convince the million-plus people in the broader public service, if they take zero for a couple of years, a real zero, then services will not have to be cut. If they don't take zero, and there's no evidence that a free collective bargaining process has ever produced zero, and arbitration has certainly never produced zero, then services are going to be cut. And a lot of the services really are Dalton McGuinty's legacy as premier. So I think he's really saying to the teaching community, I was good to you when I had the money. Now I don't have the money. And unless you're going to take a 2-year zero, we're going to lose some of the gains that we've made in education.
What do you think of that message?
I think it's a mistake. I think it won't work. I think the YouTube video says, I'm afraid to talk to the teachers, I'm afraid to talk to the press, because I'm going to get mugged on this. If he uses the word ask over and over, if he's asking, then the answer is going to be no. if he's dictatorial about this, if he wants to lay it down. We do have kind of what's developing a two-stage negotiation process that started last time. The boards and the teachers kind of negotiate with the provincial government about the size of the grant. And then they go back to the boards and they mug each other over how much of the grant they get to keep. We seem to be heading towards a province-wide bargaining situation in steps. So he seems to be putting down that marker. And he's got some very stiff levers on his side if he wants to use them. He can say, I'm not going to contribute to your pension anymore. You're on your own for that. He can do things like that. He's got that kind of power himself. He doesn't have, the boards are really the employers of the teachers, so he can't interfere in the collective bargaining. But he seems to be sticking a stick in the spokes here of the collective bargaining, that he's going to intervene in some way. And I think he's going to find out that he'll get exactly the same answer that Bob Rae got. The answer's no. Do what you have to do. We bargain with school boards.
Doretta?
I think the province, the message really went out to the province, not so much to the teachers directly, but to the voters of the province of Ontario. Because for the same, I agree with Doug, I think the message was not, if he wanted to talk to the teachers and negotiate, he could have done that directly. This went to a broader audience. And now I think it's, Premier Dad has promised to take everyone to Disneyland and found out that he got laid off. So it's not going to happen. And I agree with Doug. I think the answer is going to be no. Like every government has found out over the last few decades that there is no negotiation.
Can I jump in? There's been a lot of reaction from the teachers and from our panelists about process here and about how to talk to teachers, how to have a dialogue. But let's not forget that YouTube was not his first cameo on this issue. He did make a cameo as well the week before when the education minister sat down or had a teleconference with the union leaders, and Dalton made a surprise appearance and weighed in. So they have had some dialogue, and they are talking at the table. And it's true that this provincial table is kind of a voluntary ad hoc arrangement, but it's a way to bring some coherence to a system where you have about, 74 school boards across the province. The province is the paymaster, and it's an attempt to just try to have a more coherent, a more streamlined negotiating process, and there'll be plenty of chance to talk about dialogue. It's early days.
Cameron, the initial response from the teachers' union, the elementary teachers' union, was, this is an insult, we can't abide this is appalling, he's made a huge mistake here. What did you think of the advisability of that reaction?
It's understandable, Steve. Why pinpoint those two aspects? I mean, no more sick days and a salary freeze. First of all, does he really know why teachers are accumulating those days? I mean, he's got to get to the bottom of that. How many days are they taking? Are they taking 5, 10? What are the reasons they're taking them? Well, if they're not taking them, maybe that means they're really devoted to their job and they're really motivated. So those are some of the questions that we have to start asking ourselves. And in terms of the salary freeze, teachers work hard for their money. Absolutely. I think there's this kind of misconception that teachers have this luxurious life and they get summers off. I'm sorry, it's one of the most stressful jobs out there. My research is on stress, and it's proven that stress is one of the top 3, teaching is one of the most top 3 stressful jobs out there. You have to be really aware of that, and when we start making these policies, that could definitely affect teachers' stress level and teachers' burnout.
We'll follow up on that a little bit more, because I got an email from a teacher today who actually made some of the points you did, and we'll talk about that more in a bit. But Michael, again, from a political standpoint, how advisable was it that the first reaction to that YouTube clip from the union was as harsh as it was? It was toughly worded statement.
I sometimes I think the public sector unions are like the Bourbon kings. They forget nothing and learn nothing. If they're not willing to countenance the financial circumstances of the province in their bargaining, which they were unwilling to do the last time, so they were legislated, then they will be legislated either by the McGuinty government or by the next government. There is no way that the taxpayers of Ontario are going to pay more taxes or countenance the borrowing of more money to pay wage increases in an era when the public sector wage increases have been fantastically larger than the private sector increases. So The private sector went through a very stiff recession. Companies went bankrupt. It hasn't recovered. That's why the public sector has a financial problem. So I just think that, you know, Ontarians are going to, as they did in the recent election for mayor, they're going to vote their wallets. And so McGuinty faces a choice. He can try and get there voluntarily. I spent 3 months in a room with all of the people that would be involved in this drama, and some of them are the same people, and there was no voluntary road there. So the Ray government, a government far more sympathetic to the labor movement than the current government, rolled up its sleeves and legislated an outcome. I don't know who will legislate the outcome, but you know, nobody's going to countenance a Greek scenario where you just keep borrowing to pay wage increases.
Doug, let the record show this is the Secretary to Cabinet from a former NDP government in Manitoba who's saying there is a finite amount to which the Ontario taxpayer will, with which the Ontario taxpayer will put up. To which you respond what?
A small analogy, if you would. 4 or 5 people are driving in a car. The driver's drunk. He hits a lamp post, and he says, everybody in this car is going to pay for the lamp post and the car insurance. The drunk driver was Wall Street, and he's trying to give the bill to everybody else. Everybody else is saying, no, you need to pay that bill yourself, not us. We had no responsibility for this. The budget was in balance in 2007, and in 2008 there was a surplus. The public sector is not responsible for the deficit. The deficit came from fighting the recession and supporting those private sector companies that survived, like General Motors, and are now thriving. They need to be given the bill for this, not the public sector and not the rest of the taxpayers.
Doretta, it wasn't the teacher's fault. Why should they have to pay? That's the argument.
Well, the problem is there's the lag between what happens in the private sector economy, how it affects the public sector economy. I'm not an economist, but the pay the piper time is here because the economy was so bad for the last few years, and it hasn't recovered, certainly not in Ontario, and I don't care what the Canadian numbers say, Ontario still has not recovered. There's the lag in tax revenues, and it doesn't matter whose fault it is. The reality is somebody has to make up the difference, and you can't keep asking the taxpayer to do that.
Martin, it sounds as if Doug is making a bit of a, you know, the 99% argument versus the 1%. The 1% is responsible for the mess we're in, he argues. Why should the 99% have to pay back? Does that have any currency with you?
Well, there's 99 and 1, but there's also the 5 drivers in the car. And in this case, I think let's not forget that the government did increase its budget deficit in order to have some stimulus with the economy. But many of those workers in the private sector who were helped out have taken big hits. So what we see is a public sector where workers have also retrenched and reduced their salary demands. But let's not also, Michael mentioned a few moments ago that the public sector settlements have been a bit out of whack. I looked again this morning, and it's looking more like, I believe the private sector averages over the last year or so, a lagging average is about 1.9% in the private sector. In the public sector, it's about 1.5% or so. Municipalities are a little higher. So it isn't as bad as people think about public sector settlements.
That's over what period of time?
Roughly a year ending last October. So from
If
2010,
if you go back 3 years or
2011.
5 years or 7.
Correct. And let's go back 4 years to the teachers in 2008, where they got 12.5% over 4 years, roughly 3%
before that.
a year.
Yeah.
So you're talking a fairly high base and pretty generous increments that were signed. The government honored that contract, and now the feeling is it's your turn to do your share.
Steve, did the MPPs give themselves a 25% raise in 2007?
Yes.
That ought to do them about 15 years, I would say. And if they're prepared to cut the wages, this is not a freeze, it's a cut with inflation, then they need to cut their own wages by about $8,000 to $10,000 a year to make that even.
Michael?
Yeah. This is why you have to legislate these things, because every group looks at some other group and they say, oh, it's not our fault. Of course it's not your fault. The teachers, doctors, nurses
Police officers.
do fine work. They work very hard, but the pay system doesn't take any account of the financial circumstances of an entity called Ontario. So we're borrowing $16 billion a year, which we are paying out largely in wages. And what Dr. Drummond has said, and I agree with his assumptions, is that Ontario is not going to grow at 3 or 4%, it's going to grow at 2%, which
Dr.
means that
Drummond-
we will be borrowing $30 billion in 4 years if we continue on the current course. There is no way to balance the Ontario budget while continuing to pay wage increases to 1 million people in the public sector.
Doretta and then Doug. Doretta first.
And
please.
it's not just the wage increases, it's the benefits that go along with it. That's a big part of the cost. Right now in Ontario, the school board liability for retirement benefits is about $3.5 billion. The total education budget is about $19 billion. That's a big portion of that budget, and that's something that I think the Premier has addressed. Drummond certainly addressed it, that this is a big cost to school boards.
Doug.
I read the Drummond report, and he said, don't do wage controls. They don't work. They just lead to catch up later. Big mistake to do wage controls. Cut programs.
I agree with that. Believe it or not, history made. I
beg to
agree with
differ.
him.
I think he said budget for zero increases don't legislate a salary
You read the
increase.
lines where he said, don't do wage controls.
That's right. He said don't try to bottle it up. Don't try to bottle
Because
it up.
people will just
Bottles
try
it
and
up
catch
as they
up
get
when
more
it's time.
labor.
They will.
That's
So
right.
we
That's
should
right.
pay the providers more to deliver less to the public. You can see where the public feel that paying doctors 10% more, paying nurses 10% more, and paying for it by reducing the services is not something that they're very keen about.
Cameron, you want to get in on this?
I think the debate is totally relevant in terms of how this affects teachers, and we have to think about other public sectors, like where there's been abuses in the past with the e-health. I mean, why are teachers paying the bill for what Doug mentioned earlier? Someone who's kind of driven the bus in a crazy way. We shouldn't be pointing the finger at teachers. There are other areas where there have been abuses and mismanagement, and we have to look at those and rectify things and move on.
Well, let me just follow up on that
Look at those other
then.
sectors.
If the
Absolutely.
idea is, and Doug, I'll pick up on this with you, if the idea is whoever drove that car into the lamppost and wrecked the economy for everybody else, if we've got to go after them, are you saying let's hike the corporate tax to 50% on corporations in the province?
Let's certainly not cut it the way the government was planning
Well, they're
to
not
do.
gonna cut it.
They're not going to cut
They're
it.
not gonna cut it.
And there's a lot of room with well-heeled individuals as well to pay a good deal more.
Can you make up $16 billion by taxing the
For a
rich
few
more?
people? No.
Understand in Ontario, teachers would fall into that well-heeled group, as would doctors, as would public servants.
I would say no.
Well, on the numbers.
No,
on
the
numbers,
number starts way above that. The number starts at $150,000, $200,000.
The 1% number, but you can't pay this off on the back of the 1%. Your
never
high-income
happen. It's
earners
just
in
not enough.
Ontario include
We have
teachers.
we have lower corporate
include
taxes
doctors.
than all
One
the
at a time,
states
please.
around us.
Finish the point, Michael. Sorry.
If you take the best paid people in Ontario, say the top 20% of income earners, it includes virtually all the teachers, all the doctors, most of the nurses, certainly all the hospital administrators. So the idea that the public sector is the poorly paid group in the society doesn't hold water. If you're going to tax high income earners, then what you're saying is we'd rather have a wage increase and we'll pay a higher level of taxation. Well,
Steve,
that's one way to go.
Doug,
Steve,
then Martin.
there's an argument. You take any isolated community, Sudbury, Peterborough, Owen Sound, whatever. Now take the public sector wages out of that environment. Even give them a 2-year freeze and a 2-year cutback. All those teachers, all those nurses, all those civil servants are not going to be buying a car, are not going to be eating in the restaurants, are not going to be buying a dishwasher. There's a very strong argument in the United States, you see it with Obama, if you take public sector payments out of the economy, you can tip us back into another recession.
I hear you there, but so is the antidote to that double everybody's wages, and that way we'll make sure that everybody spends a lot of money on new
No,
cars?
but you have to be very careful when you cut back wages.
Well, that's a false economy,
tell the
though.
car dealer in Sudbury that the public sector is not going to be buying any cars for the next 2 or 3 years. You go tell
won't
them.
be happy.
and
Doretta.
But that's almost a false economy because the public sector's paid out of tax revenues. And if there are no tax revenues coming from new wealth and new manufacturing, then it's a Ponzi. It ends up being a Ponzi scheme.
Martin.
I agree with Doug. We should stop corporate tax cuts. But as you point out, that's already been done, and that's going to save about $800 million. I agree with Doug that we should raise tax rates for the rich. I'm not sure I would define it at a teacher's salary at about $90,000 or $45,000 to $90,000 per year, depending on their skill. But I've done the numbers, and if you look at taxing people over about $200,000 a year, or up to let's say $500,000 a year, you can get anywhere from you can capture an extra, let's say, $500 to maybe $1.5 billion. So that's not going to get
tax them
you.
at what rate?
If you go from about the top marginal rate in Ontario is what 11 and 0.15. So if you go up to 13% or so, basically you could increase at the top rate about 50%. There's a way to do it. I've written about it in a recent column. You can, I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head. But
the point is that doesn't get you very
it
close
gets
to
you
16.
From 500 million to about 1.5 billion, depending on how tough you want to be on the top earners. Let's say about over $200,000 a year, which is what Joe the plumber was in the U.S. So that's not going to dig you out of the hole. What the government is looking at is not just, and I want to put this on the table as well, just to provoke my friends here. They're not just talking about a salary freeze. If you look at what McGuinty said in the YouTube video, he said a real freeze, which means not just 0 and 0. It also means freezing the grid, and the grid is part of the equation.
Explain what that means.
And that means the simplest way is at my newspaper. If you're a starting reporter, you have the first-year rate, and you go up to a 5-year rate. With teachers, I think the gradations are about 12 years, as I recall.
10.
Thank you. 10 to 10 or so.
10, yeah.
So about half of the teachers at any one time are going up on the pay scale based on experience and education. And so that in itself adds about an extra, I don't know, 150 million or so to 120 million a year to the equation. If you cut back on if you do 0 and 0, that'll save you another, I think, about $250 million. And the sick days adds up as well. Because that's a liability. A teacher can cash in at the end of their retirement about 200 days per year, which is almost 2/3 of their year.
Hold that thought. We're going to pick up on the sick days, but I want to talk about freezing the grid first. Cameron, tell me this. If at the end of the day the solution here is to freeze the grid, meaning teachers can't make more money by moving higher up to a higher pay scale, in other words, what do you think the ramifications of that would be?
I think they could be quite scary, Steve, in that, as I mentioned earlier, I look at the relationship between teacher stress and teachers' burnout. Freezing their salary won't, I mean, we can't draw a causal link immediately saying because we're going to freeze their salary, they're going to become more stressed and more burned out. However, we can think that we are irking them. We're not giving them the best conditions that they deserve. Teachers have, as I mentioned earlier, a very highly stressful job. Why? Because they have these daily interactions with students where they're dealing, sometimes they're dealing with 3/4 of the class or half the class has special needs. It's just a small token. I think another important point, another research paper that I've published is on student teachers' motivation to become teachers, and it's not the monetary aspect. So the little help that they can receive through their salary is super important. Don't go cutting it.
Okay,
freezing it.
Doretta, let me put this to you. One of the things that I've heard is that if you take a teacher who, let's say, is in their 2nd or 3rd year, and you freeze them at that spot on the grid, meaning if they go to the 4th year, 5th year, 6th year, they're still going to be paid at the lower level, do you increase the likelihood that that teacher is going to quit teaching?
I can't speak for the individual teacher. It depends. It will depend if they really like their job, if they really enjoy what they're doing. Maybe they'll stick it out for a few years, hoping that that it'll pay off in the end. And maybe you will be weeding out the ones that are in there for the wrong reasons. I don't know. But a teacher who is slightly more tenured, that the grid issue wouldn't affect them. So.
Doug?
Can I jump in on that, Steve?
Yeah,
Sorry,
go
I'd just
ahead,
like
Cameron,
to
and
add
we'll get
something to it. There's an important statistic there, Loretta, in that between 30 and 50% of teachers quit within the first 3 to 5 years. Now, that's an alarming statistic. And why is that happening? Because, as I mentioned earlier, teaching is a highly stressful job.
That may
they
be
need
true,
support.
but it might not be because of what they're paid. It may be because they don't have the tools with which to teach. Maybe they don't have the confidence. Maybe they don't have the proper training that they need. So there's lots of other issues
The reporter in me here wants to ask, that 30 to 50% quit within 3 to 5 years, where'd you get that from? What's the source of that, Cameron?
I've seen that with the Ministry of Education's publications. They've come out with it openly, and it alarms them because that's a huge cost to society. They're going through how many years of academia. I mean, they're doing their undergraduate degree and then teachers college, so that's 5 years of university training, to abandon or drop out of the profession that has huge economic and social consequences, Steve.
Okay, Doug Little?
The grid is only half seniority. Half of it is improving yourself through education. The message is don't improve yourself through education. Don't become a better teacher because you're not going to be paid for it. The second one is there's a big intangible. If you think it's a no-cost item to freeze teachers' wages, it's not. What happens is they become demoralized. The United States Education Week just put out a thing that teacher morale is at a 25-year low in the United States because of the inability to raise their wages. Teacher morale is a very important thing. The union doesn't have to do a thing. When you control the teacher's situation like this, they start walking away from the extracurricular activities. They start walking away from anything that they don't have to do. No message from the union. They just walk away from it. They say, life's too stressful, I've got too many things to mark, I've got too many other things to do. It's a very heavy cost to society. It's just a very hard thing to put a number on.
Michael?
I'm very sympathetic to all the bad things that are going to happen, but they're going to happen in every other jurisdiction. They've already happened in the United States. And it doesn't really matter how we got there. I mean, Wall Street behaved badly, people in the US bought houses they couldn't afford. None of that actually is germane to the situation going forward. I mean, Ontario will have the revenue that it has, and that revenue isn't enough to support both meeting the needs, the service needs, and giving people, you know, what would be seen as normal wage increases. So you can either raise taxes, and you know, I think our colleague from the Star has done a good job of setting out what you could get out of that. And what you could get out of that is maybe 15% of what you need to get, maybe 20.
Is that still worth doing?
You know, I expect we will see some things done in that area. Certainly they're not going to proceed with the corporate tax reductions. They may put something on the high end, but it doesn't deal with the reality that most public sector workers, the wage increase that we see, the 12.5%, is only part of the changing compensation. So doctors are the extreme example. The doctors could take zero for 5 years, and the cost of physician services would go up somewhere between 5 and 7% a year because of the way it's structured. So the government's problem is much tougher than it appears, because when he says a real zero, that's what they need. They actually, to make the balanced budget work over 5 or 6 years, they need real zeros. But the public, and I think everybody who's involved as a public sector worker, thinks zero is a zero on the pay increase, but everything else continues along. So I have, you know, I think you're just seeing a sample tonight of how tough this is going to be, because every group will make the same argument. Dispirited doctors, dispirited nurses.
Having thrown that stick of dynamite on the table about the grid, the evil or hot potato grid, let's just clarify. The government is saying they want to freeze it for 2 years, as I think Mr. Decter did back in the 90s under the Ray government, but only for 2 years, and then they want to renegotiate the grid and make it a little more streamlined and a little less expensive. So that's up for negotiation, but it's definitely the hot button item. Let's not forget, teachers' unions understood that they were facing 0-0 because others were facing 0-0. The nurses signed 0-0, and then a bit at the end in their third year. They got a signing bonus. The doctors are going to get 0 and 0, and a number of other sectors are also facing
City of Toronto workers got 0.
The grid, and I'm coming to that. It's a good point. The grid, though, is the complicating factor, because that's the total pay package. So it's more than just a freeze. The second thing, though, is that you're right. Rob Ford is lurking in the background here. Teachers read the newspapers. They watch shows like this one. They are among the most politically informed and engaged and active people in society. And they meet people at parent-teacher nights who have lost their jobs, who are unable to afford the fees for field trips. They understand that what the economic reality out there. To Michael's point, I don't think Dalton McGuinty is going to raise prices, taxes, I should say, on high-income earners, even if he wanted to, because he doesn't have the political room to do it in the culture that we live in now. Taxes are a dirty word, so that's not going to happen. And I think most teachers realize that. So his margin of maneuver is really quite limited, and I think unions recognize that, and what we're seeing now, to come back to the beginning, is some posturing by all sides. Union leaders are politicians too. They have to show their members that they are fighting hard.
They got to get elected too.
But I don't believe the membership is clueless to the economic realities out there.
Done.
Yeah. Teacher union leaders are elected by their convention, which is the most militant 3% of their membership. If they say, I'm going to go easy on the government this time, they won't be the leader of the union. They'll be pulled off the stage if they've already won for a 2-year period.
Is that to say we really shouldn't listen to what they say then because they've got to throw some red meat to the troops?
No. The teachers follow, the teachers ask for a strike vote, they get about a 95% strike vote. The members fall in line, they're extremely loyal, they know where the bacon comes from. If we can turn it political for a second, Steve, no government that takes on the teachers this way survives.
Well, no, none of them have.
None of them have.
Yeah.
That's right.
And Christy Clark will go down in British Columbia for what she's doing there. Bob Rae went down for this. Took 2 terms for Harris to go down. He was wounded the first time. Took Eves out the second time. They're going to lose. And the Liberals are going to come third in the next election if they do this.
Here's the bigger question, though. Here's the bigger question. The teachers didn't like David Peterson in the late 1980s, so they took him down.
Yeah.
Then they got Bob Rae. They didn't like the social contract any better, so they took him down and they got Mike Harris.
Yeah.
I don't think they like that any better.
No.
So if they take this guy down, who's the education premier and who's given them pretty much everything they've wanted over the last 8 years, do they really think they're going to get something better?
It doesn't matter. The government has to get the message. You fight us, you lose. That's the message they want to get to them. We'll go to the next party. We'll go to the NDP again and start around again. But the fact is, you need to get the message. We don't just go for you economically, we go for you politically.
Doretta.
The other thing people forget is that people who were parents back in the days of the social contract and days of action and illegal walkouts aren't parents anymore. They're worried about health care now because their children have gone through the school system for the most part. Now maybe their children or their older children are young parents in the system who were in school at that time and were victims of strikes and action. So I don't know, the appetite for the public for any political strikes or action by these unions, I think will be met with a very different attitude.
Let me get Michael on this for a second, because you're the only guy sitting around this literal and metaphorical table, I think, who's actually been in the back rooms advising premiers and cabinet ministers on this stuff. Do they understand what Doug just said, which is, we don't care what you've done for us for 8 years. If you don't do right by us now, we're going to take you down and we don't care what comes next.
Oh yeah, I think they understand
They
it,
do get that.
and what's intriguing is that in the face of that, they have all decided to do what I think is in the public interest, each one of them. So there is no party that, whatever they promise when they're in opposition, is going to go down the road with what the teachers' unions want, because it isn't what the public wants. And yes, it's a society in which narrow groups who are self-interested can defeat governments because they're very organized. It is exactly the problem that has brought Europe into the situation it's in, because public sector unions drove benefit levels that bankrupted governments. So your choice as a premier, and I've worked for premiers of every stripe, your choice, and it was a very hard choice for Bob Rae, was do you do the social contract? Do you say to people you're going to take a 3-year, 5% wage cut, you're going to get time off in lieu, unpaid? Or do you allow 50,000 jobs to disappear in the public sector? That was the stark choice. Those are the numbers. If you simply cut spending, so you send the school board less, you send the hospital board less, all the people like the teachers who are unionized and have collective agreements, they're fine. They get their wage increases, they get their benefits, they get their movement and grid. And who gets laid off? All the lower paid workers who aren't unionized in the public sector. There are plenty of those. They work in daycare centers, they work as teachers' aides, they work right across the system. And the Rae government was unwilling to put lower paid people in the public sector out of work to continue to pay increases to the better paid people.
In the middle of the
I
worst
think it was their finest hour. But the teachers' unions, they didn't care. They cared about their package. And to be fair, that's what they're elected to do. Their job is to fill their members' pockets with bacon, and they're very good at it. But is it in the interest of Ontario? Not at this time.
Martin.
Well, I'm not suggesting that they're getting bacon. I think they're being paid a fair wage for working very hard. Everyone knows teachers work hard. But to go back to the political element here, first of all, the last union leader who tried to do even better for his members than the other unions, which is the leader of the elementary school teachers, lost his job because he blew it. Instead of taking 12.5% that was on the table, he insisted on more, and he lost that amount of money and ended up with 10.5%. So
And lost his job.
lost his job. So you can overcalculate, you can throw too much red meat for the members. And I think elementary teachers are aware of that, and this is what's going on in the background here. That's one of the reasons why the elementary teachers walked out first, because they are bristling and they're trying to make a point. But to the overall question of the Premier and losing office, I think in Michael's business, investment business, past performance is not necessarily an indicator of future performance. And I think in terms of premiers losing power, yes, Bob Rae lost and begat the Harris government. We have also seen, though, that David Miller lost and begat the Rob Ford government. And we've seen how they approach unions, and there's a lot more strong-arm tactics than we've seen with the McGuinty government. The McGuinty government has also, in terms of services, which Michael referred to, made clear that they will keep full-day kindergarten, despite Drummond's recommendation that you should trash it. They've also suggested that they will keep class sizes, caps on class sizes at about 20.
Despite Drummond as well.
Despite Drummond. And that's worth about 7,000 jobs for teachers. So that's an important concession that's on the table. And the elementary teachers union, though, has said they don't want, their members should not have to pay the price for that. Well, that's a trade-off that will have to be made.
I want to read this. Sorry, Doug, give me a second here if you don't mind, because I got, every day we send out an e-blast to anybody who wants to know what's on the program tonight, and one teacher saw that we were doing this discussion tonight, and she sent me this email, and I want to read just a little snippet of it here, and then Cameron, I'll go to you first with this. I am a teacher, she writes, with the Toronto District School Board. I'm writing to tell you that there's been no peace with the Liberal government since their last ultimatum that forced a contract with the TDSB teachers, whereby the teachers received 2% in pay less than the Toronto Catholic District School Board and the rest of the teachers in the province. Our 4-year contract is ending August 31st, 2012. The Liberal government has proposed another ultimatum: 0% pay increase, elimination of accumulated sick leave, putting sick leave credits from 20 days per year to 6 days per year. Teachers work every day in a, quote, germ factory and need sick days. Qualification levels will be frozen so that teachers will not receive credit for any courses they take. That will kill any initiative to educate yourself better in the profession. Frankly, the Liberal government are hypocrites, especially when they voted themselves a big increase. I wish I could vote myself the amount of salary I can take home to my family. From a teacher who preferred not to have her name known, but anyway, we've covered some of the points here. I do want to cover the sick leave, because we haven't talked about that yet in much detail. Cameron, the idea here, I gather, is that teachers have a generous sick leave package which they can bank and then cash in upon retirement, thereby enabling themselves to take an early retirement. And the sick leave that they have at the moment is much more generous than most other unions in the province. Could you speak to the fairness of all of that?
I think it's totally fair, Steve. Well, I kind of reflected upon that and drew some correlations or relationships between the fact that if you eliminate those extra sick days, between quotation marks, because they're not really extra, they deserve them. They're in the trenches every day. They're in early and they're out late. But anyway, that could, if you eliminate them, that could result in more teachers being absent from the job, just finding a way around the system. And what would that affect? Well, that would affect students' learning. So I think it's quite dire. You have to be very cautious. One has to be very cautious in taking away or reducing those sick days. Teachers need them. And how many are banking them, for retirement? And if they are, and in the fact that they are banking them, it's just for such a short period. I don't see that as being a major issue, and they really have to look at that closely, Steve.
Doretta, he says the teachers need those sick days.
I don't begrudge anyone getting sick leave, paid sick leave, if it's something it's bargained for, negotiated with a reasonable number of days a year. I don't think that's a problem. It's the payout upon retirement of the bank days. If they needed them so much, why are they banking them? Because if it gets up to over 200 days, it's ridiculous. Nobody gets that. It's certainly not in the private sector. I don't know too many other unions that get that. And how that affects the classroom, I have no idea. That when the teacher's retiring, they're gone.
Well, his point is we're making it sound in this discussion like everybody banks 200 sick days a year and then retires, a year early.
No, obviously they don't.
We don't know how many do.
We don't. But we know that there's a $3.5 billion liability that sits on school boards' books to cover this. So somebody's banking them.
Doug?
This was a management request when it first came in many, many decades ago to cut down on teacher sick days. It was a management idea. That was because teachers had made very little money. Now that teachers make a good deal more money, the program has become very expensive. And many boards have negotiated this away. But you have to look at a collective agreement as a many-faceted agreement. We would like, the boards say, we would like to take that away every round of negotiations. The teachers say, how are you going to compensate us for taking it away? The boards say, no, we just want to take it away. The teachers say, forget about it. Everything is a deferred wage. It's all a certain amount of money in the end. So if you don't want to pay it as a wage, you pay it in this other form, a medical benefit, a health benefit, or something else like that.
And who pays the premium, Doug?
Of course the taxpayer does, and it's earned money. And I don't think any teacher's hand shakes when they reach for their paycheck in this province. Cameron has told us how stressful it is. And if you go to a sick day plan of 6 days, and the average is 4 right now for teachers taking off 6, they'll take off all 6 for sure. Because they'll say, you owe me 2 days. The exams are coming up at the end of the year. I'll take the 2 days to mark the exams.
Let's just understand this. You're saying that if
You'll see the number of days off go up.
Doug, they do that now.
You'll see it
Come on,
you'll
they
see it
do
go
it
up.
now.
Doug, I think you're right. I think you framed it well in terms of what sick day is all about. It's really deferred compensation, and it goes back to the 1950s and the 60s when school boards negotiated this as a perk. But they aren't. If the unions had said at the time, this is a sweetener, this is deferred compensation, maybe people would understand it in those terms. But it really has become a misnomer. One way of describing sick pay is a retirement gratuity. But people don't normally get retirement gratuities unless they're getting a buyout or something. So we need to call sick days, and then deferred compensation, and not mix the two in together, because when you conflate them, you make it sound like you're taking away a teacher's right to be sick. And
Michael
they will
Lecter.
get not just 6 days, they'll get extra days at a reduced salary when they're really sick.
The bigger picture here, and I think the more difficult issue for Ontario, and it's not just going to be teachers, it's going to be the whole province, is that Ontario was one of the wealthiest places on earth 25 years ago. And it is now not even the wealthiest place in Canada, nor does anyone think it'll regain that status. I mean, I hope it will, but the oil-producing parts of the world have become much wealthier, and the oil-producing parts of Canada are the reason Canada will grow at 3.5%. And Ontario is an oil-consuming province. So it's a very hard adjustment. When I first came to Ontario 20-some years ago from Manitoba, I was astonished at how well financed everything was in Ontario. I mean, the benefits were rich. The drug plan was, not income tested, no cost sharing, and it's very hard for any population to give things up, whether it's a teachers union or it's the whole population of Ontario. But the stark problem is that what made Ontario wealthy is under real pressure, whether it's the auto industry or it's mining in the north. And Ontario is going to have a very tough adjustment, I think, as a society, to the idea that you can't sort of say, well, we're Ontario, we ought to get paid better than everyone else in Canada. I mean, Saskatchewan is going to have higher wages than Ontario in the not too distant future. Alberta already does. And they're running balanced budgets, not huge deficits. So it's easy to get into all of the issues that are between labor and management, have been there forever. And if anything I've said comes across as being anti-teacher, my sister is a teacher. I would fight for all of her benefits and everything she does. Fortunately, she's a teacher in Manitoba, so I have clean hands here. But the problem is going to be a larger one, and the Premier's problem is, how do you have a conversation with a whole society without sounding like you're negative about your province's future? And Drummond said it, but I'm not sure it was heard.
I want to ask Doug this question. Dalton McGuinty has said, I've given you guys good wage increases. I've given you the majority of the positions on the Ontario College of Teachers. You know, you've got full-day kindergarten. You know, I haven't touched your prep time. I've brought in policies that have required the hiring of thousands more teachers. I've done all this for you for 8 years. You haven't missed a day of class because of a strike. I've done all this for you for 8 years. Now I need your help. Why do I can't comment on teachers, but why do the teacher unions seem so unwilling to want to help the education premier, as he calls himself?
Have you heard in Hollywood you're as good as your last movie?
Yes,
Doesn't matter how many Oscars there are on the mantle. We're talking about this movie, your last one, it lost money. In this case, they cannot accept it. Their membership won't allow them to accept it.
Is that true?
That's true.
I don't hear that from teachers
Well,
as much as you
the
might.
official voice of teachers is the vote of teachers.
Right.
So that would be how you'd get the message, would be at the convention. And
But you've
the
just said-
convention will say this is
they're the most
unacceptable.
militant.
But you've just said the convention is the 3% most militant members of the
They're
teaching
elected.
profession.
They're elected by a pyramid that goes all the way up there. If they don't want to if they don't want those people to represent them, much like who the MPPs are in the province, they can find other representatives for them. Nobody challenges the right that the teacher leaders represent their membership. They poll their members constantly. How do you feel about this? How do you feel about that? How do you feel about this? If they're off the pulse of the members by the slightest, they hear about it.
Do you think it's right that you're only as good as your last picture?
I think so.
How come?
Well, you take a look at who walked away. Sam Hammond of EDFO. A case could be made that EDFO was the prime beneficiary of the 4 unions in Ontario with the full-day kindergarten and the lower class size that was focused on primary. His members. It wasn't OSSTF that walked away. The union leader that Dalton McGuinty would say is the prime beneficiary was the first one to walk away. And it's because his membership would say, Sam, if you give them an inch, you're not the leader.
Okay. Let's, we got, how are we doing on time here? Got less than 10 minutes to go here, and I want to just, 6 minutes? I want to put something on the table that Don Drummond did not talk about, did not recommend, because he said, I don't deal with the Constitution, I only deal with what's possible. But, you know, the elephant in the room is the fact that we have, what is it, 5 public school board systems in the province right now? French, English, public, separate. 4. And isn't there, okay, 4. French, English, separate, public. Would a unified school system save a lot of money and obviate the need to put teachers through all this hell?
No way.
Martin.
Well, it might save a little bit at the margins, but I think it's a non-starter. I know that's not exactly your question, but it's what I have thought about the most is this possible? Just like asking about tax increases. Can tax increases solve this problem? No, because they're also a non-starter on high-income people in this province because Dalton McGuinty's boxed in. On Catholic and separate, you have to look at what happened in Newfoundland. That province had 7 systems, in fact, 7 school boards. But it was really at death's door financially, and it was just so incoherent. There was a political will, a consensus to make it happen, more or less. In Quebec, you had the language divide that predominated over a society that was less and less religious, and there was enough negotiation ahead of time that the Roman Catholic Church more or less went along with it, as I understand it, but is now deeply unhappy that they don't feel the government delivered on the promises that they thought they were entitled to. I don't think the church in Ontario is ready for it. I don't think the population in Ontario in the broadest sense is ready for it. That perhaps is debatable. But most importantly, the politicians of all parties, except for our friends in the Green Party, are not ready for this. So Liberal, Progressive Conservative, and New Democrat are not going to touch this, and the NDP have looked closely at this because many of their members are most adamant on it, and they are not going to touch it either.
Cameron, what's your view?
Yeah, I just want to kind of go along with what Martin was saying in that I don't think that should be touched at all. I mean, I'm not an economist, so what's the difference between centralization and decentralization? I'm sure Michael can go there from an economical point of view. But what I will say, Steve, is that I teach in French, and we're very proud of, the Francophones are very proud of the Francophone school boards and what Dalton McGuinty has done, the Liberal government has done to support the Francophone school boards and the French, the Catholic and the public. I think we have to continue on with this decentralized system because of their particularities that have to be respected.
Doug.
OSSTF did a study on this at one time. It would save $1 billion to consolidate the school boards, but a large amount of that was saved already with the consolidation of the boards from many small boards into larger ones, and the consolidation of busing and purchasing and some things like that. So that number is quite a bit down from there. We have a poll as well that said 70% of the Ontario population would vote to abolish the separate school system, but nobody's going to do it. Not
Well,
one of the three parties,
That's
because
the lines along the way the school system.
30% of Ontarians are Catholic, so
yeah.
that
So
makes
the
perfect sense.
70% that's not Catholic would vote to do away with
course.
it. But nobody wants the brush fire.
Right.
All of them are elected in both predominantly Catholic and predominantly non-Catholic areas,
Yeah.
and they all have MPPs that are going, no.
Michael?
I would make an odd analogy, but when the federal government tried to change the Constitution and Pierre Elliott Trudeau was still alive, they ran into a firestorm that they didn't survive on Meech. And I think as long as William Grenville Davis, the premier that brought the Catholic school system into the mainstream financially, is still with us, there isn't a chance in the world that a legislature is going to touch it. It's just not on. And so, you know, 70% of the population could support it, but you need part of the 30% to become the government of Ontario. Doesn't matter what party you are.
Gotcha. Doretta, we've got about a minute and a half here. Let me put this to you. Don't misunderstand me here, folks. We're delighted that you're all here on the program today. However, we did invite the following to join us, and they all declined. Education Minister Laurel Broden, the Ontario Teachers Federation, the Ontario English Catholic Teachers Association, the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation, the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario, and l'Association des enseignantes et des enseignants franco-ontariens. All of the people who are in a position to actually do what we've been talking about didn't want to talk about it today. What do you infer from that?
I think they're right now they're too busy puffing and posturing at this point, and I think negotiations are certainly going on behind the scenes that we don't know about. But one thing that I wanted to bring up that Drummond talked about is an opportunity to do things differently. Instead of amalgamating school boards that I don't think would really save money because bureaucracies find a way to sustain themselves, like we saw with the amalgamation of the City of Toronto. I think creating a monopoly that's even more of a monopoly is worse. Maybe do things differently. Maybe give parents a voucher or give them a way to choose their schools that is less money.
Okay, that's a different show. That's a different show, and we got to go. She got it in with 30 seconds to go, but we got to go now. Anyway, it's good of all of you to join us tonight here on TVO. Cameron Montgomery at the University of Ottawa. Merci beaucoup. Thank you for being there on the line for us from the nation's capital.
Merci.
And back
Thank
here
you
in
so
our
much.
studio, Michael Dechter, the former Deputy Minister of Health. Like the time, Michael. Wear that the next time we invite you on to talk healthcare, okay?
Yes, well, Norman Rockwell.
There you go.
Nice.
Doretta Wilson from the Society for Quality Education. Doug Little, read him on the Little Education Report. Martin Redcon from the Toronto Star. Thanks so much, everybody.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.